what we hear can change the flavor of what we're eating. There was a great experiment by Charles Spence. He called it, I think, the sonic chip. He gave a bunch of people in a lab some Pringles out of the can, and he put headphones on them. And for some of the people eating the Pringles, he turned up the volume of their own crunching. And those people perceived those chips as being fresher than the ones who just heard it at the regular volume. In general, smell is definitely the most powerful one, especially when it comes to things like wine. And it's that flavor. It's a smell plus the taste plus the other senses that creates flavor. Flavor is really created more in your mind than it is on your tongue.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McShane, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 217. How does telling your dinner party guests a few details about the wine you're serving dramatically change their perception of its taste? Should you add wines from Uruguay to your must-try list? And what's the difference between flavor and taste? You'll hear those stories and tips in our chat with Nell McShane Wulfhart. 3 of you are going to win the audiobook edition of her book, Off Menu, about the secret science of food, drinks, and the dining experience. It's fascinating. Just email me and let me know you want to win. Now, a quick update on my upcoming memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. So great news for those of you who love to listen, which would be all of you. My agent has just sold the audio rights for my memoir to Tantor Audio, one of the largest audiobook companies in the U.S. They'll produce the audiobook, which will be available worldwide. Yes! They've given me the first opportunity to audition to be narrator. However, if I'm not a fit, I just used air quotes there, I get to approve the person who will read the book. And then I'll pick Reese Witherspoon. Anyway, I'm so thrilled with this because audiobooks are how I read, and apparently an increasing number of people do as well. The pandemic really accelerated the growth of audiobooks, and now with big players like Spotify investing $3.5 billion in the audiobook space, there's more excitement than ever. So I know you listen to podcasts, or at least this one. Do you listen to audiobooks? Do you have a favorite audiobook you can recommend to me? Let me know. So here's a review from Kathy Kelly, a beta reader from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A great and powerful memoir. This book is quite interesting and really made me think. I also really enjoy books with data and scientific findings, and I appreciate that she provided evidence, quotes, and examples from other books that work in tandem with her own experience. I like that she wove in the witch references throughout the book. 5 stars. Thank you, Kathy. I've posted a link to a blog post called Diary of a Book Lunch in the show notes at nataliemclain.com/217. This is where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know that you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at this manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemclain.com. Okay, on with the show. Nell McShane Wulfhart is a decision coach and an author. She has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and many other outlets. Her most recent book, The Great Stewardess Rebellion, about how flight attendants in the 1960s and 70s staged a revolution for working women everywhere, is described by the Wall Street Journal as exhilarating. And the paper reviewer also wrote, Wulfhart is a vivid storyteller who writes with energy and style. Nell's audiobook, Off Menu, is about the secret science of food, drinks, and the dining experience. And she joins me now from her home in Uruguay. Nell, welcome. So great to have you here with us. Correct my pronunciation right off the bat there.
Actually, you would say Uruguay, but I wouldn't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm just not going to bring it up again. But it's so great to have you. Now, before we dive into your book, Off Menu, let's chat briefly about your latest book, which is on a completely different topic, but I think equally interesting, especially to those of us who travel a lot, The Great Stewardess Rebellion. It's received rave reviews. I already quoted the Wall Street Journal, but for our listeners, give a couple of other reviews. The New York Times described it as a meticulously detailed history, dramatic, invigorating, and instructive. Cool. The Washington Post said, Wulfhart, through her prodigious research, secures a place for women who endured all manner of indignities to forge a better future for those who put their lives on the line every day in a job once regarded as frivolous. Wow. So what drew you to that subject, Nell?
Well, I've been a journalist for many, many years, and I think every journalist out there is always looking for a book idea, because instead of working on 20 different articles at once, we love the idea of just working on one thing for a prolonged period of time. Off Menu, the book we're going to talk about today, the audiobook, that was something like that, just something that really caught my interest. And my latest book, The Great Stewardess Rebellion, it's a true story. It's about flight attendants in the 1960s and 70s who banded together, changed the airline cabin, which was the most sexist workplace in the United States at the time, into like a place where they actually had rights as workers through the power of the women's movement and the labor movement and just sheer doggedness, I think. And just for me, that was like, those subjects are super interesting. And I think everybody loves a stewardess, and it's just like interesting to hear stories about stewardesses. Even the word is kind of captivating.
It is. It's exotic in a way. And is it still correct to say stewardesses, or do they generalize to steward now? Or is there another word for it? I was just curious.
I think now we just use flight attendant. Once men started flying on domestic airlines in the early 70s, for a little while they said stewards and stewardesses, but that became, I think, very awkward. And now flight attendant is sort of like police officer, like just nice gender neutral term.
Absolutely. Okay, good. What was the most surprising thing you learned while researching or writing the book?
Oh my gosh, pretty much everything. It's a very dramatic story. I did not realize that things had been so difficult for women working in the 60s and 70s. If you were a stewardess in the 60s, you would be fired if you got married. You would be fired if you got pregnant. If you managed to avoid both of those things, you would be fired when you turned 32, because the airlines wanted to keep the stewardesses really young, and there were incredibly strict weight limits. You also had to keep your weight like under a certain amount.
Wow.
And if you gained a couple pounds, you could just be pulled right off a flight. The uniforms are astounding. There's a ton of those in my book. Amazing uniforms. The whole world of work for women in the 60s and 70s is fascinating. And it's not just for North America, too. There's some good stuff about some Canadian airlines in there as well.
Oh, excellent. Juicy. And when you say the outfits were astounding, do you mean they were highly sexualized?
Not just sexualized, but sort of ludicrous. Southwest Airlines at one point, the uniform in the 70s was a pair of bright orange hot pants and white lace-up go-go boots. And this is the sort of thing, like if you're going to be serving hot coffee to 150 passengers at one time, it's not really what you'd want to be wearing.
No.
One of the Canadian ones, they had sort of a frontier flight where they were flying loggers, I think, to and from the sites. And they had like fringed vests and very short mini skirts, like tartan mini skirts, sort of like a Wild West aesthetic.
Oh, wow.
Also
very cute.
Impractical.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. I want to get into that as well, that book. So you've done your own fair share of traveling. Tell us about some of the places you've lived and how perhaps they did or didn't tie into your travel column for the New York Times.
I have been living abroad. I'm from Philadelphia originally, but I've been living abroad since I was 18. So many, many years. I was at university in Dublin. I lived in Vietnam for almost 5 years. I lived in Korea for a year. I lived in Sri Lanka for a while. And I've been living in Uruguay for 8 years, I think, at this point. I enjoy traveling. I enjoy not being in the United States. And every day when I read the news from the United States, I feel happier and happier to be far away. And yeah, it's been really wonderful. So I've written a lot for the New York Times travel section over the years, lots of 36 hours in Bogota or 36 hours in Buenos Aires, places like that.
Sure.
And my column that ran for 3 years, and that was interviewing celebrities about what they took in their carry-on luggage, which was the fluffiest yet most fun and probably easiest writing gig I have ever had. Just call up RuPaul, get him to tell you about all the stuff he brings in his luggage, send it off.
What does he put in his luggage, by the way, RuPaul?
Oh, RuPaul is like such a professional. Like, you know, if you ever watch Drag Race, he's always talking about his suits and the maker of his suits. So he told me all about his suits and who makes the suits. Everything is like branded. Everything is like really on point and professional. I was trying to get him to tell me about like all the drag stuff he takes, but I think the sheer size of it was just too much. The costumes, the makeup, like everything is overwhelming.
And was there any celebrity who took something really strange that you remember?
The thing I remembered most clearly was Adie Bryant, who is on Saturday Night Live, and you know she's a comedian. She has a lot of TV shows, and one of the things that she always brought with her was her own very colorful pillowcase from home.
Okay.
Because she said, like, not only does your own pillowcase, like when you're staying in a hotel or something, make you feel sort of homey and it has the right smell and it feels nice to use, but when you're doing like, you know, Zooms or FaceTimes or any kind of video chat, it adds this sort of pop of color to the background, which she thought was like really nice. I had never thought about it before, but yeah, I like it.
Absolutely. And you can get those silky pillowcases that they're supposed to be better for sleeping. Anyway, I'm going down a rabbit hole. Save me now. How did you end up in Uruguay?
Well, like I said, I've been living abroad for a really long time, and most of my journalism career has been travel. So, you know, I prefer living abroad, but Uruguay specifically because my partner actually got a job here.
Ah, okay.
Or actually, I found the job and was like, apply for this job. And he got it, and we've been here ever since.
Ah, awesome. And this is apparently like you have a strong focus on food and, of course, travel, but not as much of a focus on wine in your past. But you say when you arrived in the country, that's when you really started to learn about wine. How did that happen?
You know, I think it's when you're just thinking about wines of the world, it can feel totally overwhelming. Like, I have the memory of a goldfish. Like, I cannot possibly remember, like, what region of France, like, the wines I prefer come from. Like, that's never going to happen. So living in South America, it was like, okay, at least the wines I'm drinking now are sort of more contained. They come from, like, a few, you know, they come from Argentina, or they come from Brazil, or they come from Uruguay, or they come from Chile. And I feel like I can learn about these wines. So I think just narrowing the focus helped me. And also just probably getting slightly more successful career-wise and being able to afford more wine was also something that helped. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I don't get to taste much Uruguayan wine. Look, I don't know why I keep going back to the word that I'm butchering, but is Tanat their major red grape wine?
Yes. Tanat is, I would say, the main grape here. And it is, as I'm sure you know, it is really strong. It's really powerful. And you would almost never drink it just on its own. Like, it's really a wine that goes with food.
Right.
Tanat on its own is very tannic. Yes.
Tannic, because isn't that the root of the word or the grape? Tanat?
Yeah, exactly.
Refers to the tannins? Okay. Yeah. So does decanting help it? Like, do you ever try that?
Oh, definitely. It definitely helps. But I would just say, as a general rule, unless you're buying very high-end Tanat, it's a food that, I mean, it pairs perfectly with steak, which is sort of the main dish here.
Sure.
It's the thing you eat most often when you're living in Uruguay. It has a food culture very similar to Argentina, which I think people know about. A lot of like wood-fired grilling, a lot of red meat, a lot of cheese and sausage and steak. So Tanat is a great wine to pair with that.
And do you know roughly the size of the country's wine industry? Like how many wineries? I have no sense of it. I haven't written about it. So do you have a rough idea of how big it is?
The wineries here are very small.
Okay.
There are a couple of wineries that now are doing a lot of exportation. There's Bauza and there's Garzon. And those are the only two bodegas that people outside Uruguay would really be familiar with. They're the biggest. They have the most, marketing money at their disposal. But Uruguay's history of wineries is mostly family-based, very small bodegas, family-run. They've been doing it for a long time. And I would say there's probably more than 100, but there's not like 500.
Okay. That gives sense.
There's fewer than 4 million people who live here, so it's a really small country.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. All right. So let us jump into off menu. Where were you when you got the idea for this book?
I was in a bar.
Excellent.
I was
Great
in a
setting.
bar in Edinburgh. Yeah, I was writing a 36 hours in Edinburgh for the Times, and I had a really spectacular cocktail, a last word cocktail, which is usually, it's made with chartreuse, it's usually green, but the one they served here was clear. They had basically clarified the chartreuse and taken out the green, and then they served the cocktail with a tiny tablet that could add it back in. And it was the experience, it was not just that it was a delicious cocktail, it was the experience of drinking something clear that I knew should be green and thinking about as I was drinking it, like how that perception was affecting the flavor of the cocktail. It was that sort of juxtaposition of those two things that was really interesting to me. And then I met a woman called Erica Duffy, who pops up quite a lot in the book. And she's like a former perfumer and a flavorist and an expert in all this stuff. And she kind of led me down a rabbit hole of all the things, the five senses, how they affect the things that we eat and drink and the flavor. And I just sort of ran with it.
Yeah.
It's become really fascinating.
Absolutely. I just love how you wove all of the information, but with great stories. And so how did it change the clear chartreuse? What did you expect and what did it taste like? How did you perceive the taste to change?
I think the first sip was very confusing. I don't think I knew what I was drinking. And it just highlighted that difference between expectation and reality. And one of the things I explore in the books that we'll probably get into is how the thing you expect to eat and drink is often like what you're eating and drinking, regardless of the actual thing. Like that's not very clearly put, but it's all about perception. It's really like the thing that your brain thinks you're eating or drinking is what you're eating or drinking, even if it's not the thing in front of you, like the literal thing you're putting in your mouth. And so having a drink that should be green, you could think of it with anything. Like you could color lemonade and make it blue. And theoretically, it should taste the same, right? Like the food coloring doesn't have any taste, but it doesn't. So it's all about the perception.
Right. Our minds are powerful. They do create our reality to the extent they even affect our senses or what we think we're perceiving. That is fascinating. Now, so before we dive into all that, you have a great clarification. What's the difference between taste and flavor?
I love this. I think this is so interesting. So I feel like a lot of us grew up with this idea of the tongue map, that like the tip of your tongue tastes sweet and the sides of your tongue taste salty and sour. That tongue map has been totally debunked. All of your taste buds can taste everything. But when we think about taste really is just a few modalities. It's salty, it's sour, it's bitter, it's sweet. It's not flavor. When we say that something tastes delicious, we're talking about its flavor. We're not talking about its taste. So when we talk about things like umami is like a relatively new arrival to the world of taste, right? This kind of like savory, meaty taste. That's something your tongue can pick up. But your tongue can't really pick up anything more than these 5 modalities or 6. Sometimes the definition is a little fluid, but it's
What's the 6th
limited.
One? They've added one, have they?
Well, it's like sort of a Western concept. In other places, there are other tastes. So like astringency would be considered a taste.
Yeah.
In like the United States and North America, we don't talk about astringency as being a taste. The same way we talk about sweet being a taste.
It feels more like a drying, because in wine we talk about astringency, but more as a sensation or a texture or drying than a taste.
Right. Exactly. It feels more like, exactly, like touch, precisely. But there have been some revelations from scientists, Western scientists, talking about there's a taste of like starchy or carbohydrate that our tongue can pick up. Which, I don't know, it's a growing field. A lot of these things, especially the things in my book, they're changing all the time. The expectations are different, though what we're learning is different. So I think it's fascinating.
Absolutely. And so does taste combine with smell to create flavor? Like how do we get to deliciousness, which is a flavor, as you said?
Yes, taste and smell. I mean, all of our senses can contribute to this. I talk in the book about how what we hear can change the flavor of what we're eating. There was a great experiment by Charles Spence. He called it, I think, the sonic chip, which is basically he gave a bunch of people in a lab some Pringles out of the can and he put headphones on them. And for some of the people eating the Pringles, he turned up the volume of their own crunching. So it was louder. And those people perceived those chips as being fresher than the ones who just heard it, they're crunching at the regular volume. I mean, they were the exact same Pringles, like a Pringle is a Pringle. That's sort of their appeal, right? But it was that particular sound actually affected like the flavor of what they were tasting. But
That's
I think
amazing.
in general, smell is definitely the most powerful one, especially when it comes to things like wine. And it's that flavor. It's like it's a smell plus the taste plus the other senses that creates flavor. Flavor is really created more in your mind than it is on your tongue.
Huh. Okay. And you also talk about how women are more likely to be super tasters than men are. And that's especially a sensitivity to bitterness or the burn of high alcohol in spirits. But are they super tasters also able to detect more subtle aromas? Like, do they have a wider range of what they can detect?
I think for certain things, super tasters are something I think we're still learning about. And what I think is so interesting is that although there are more women super tasters than men, and that in fact, white men in general have the lowest number of super tasters per group, when we create food and we create cocktails, like those are mostly designed with white men as their audience, beer or something. When people are creating the flavors of those things, they're targeting that audience, even though men in general are not as good at smelling things as women are. And apparently even things like at different points in your menstrual cycle, you can taste or pick up more flavors or fewer flavors if you're older or younger. Even if you're on SSRIs, that can affect how you're perceiving flavor. I mean,
so SSRIs, what are they? Serotonin uplift something. What are they? Antidepressants. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Like serotonin or whatever, Zoloft. They can diminish. Okay. And for the same reason, can being depressed diminish your sense of smell?
Yes, being depressed can diminish your sense of smell and therefore your sense of taste. A lot of people who are depressed lose interest in food, and I think that's part of the reason. I mean, our senses are affected by so many different things, and those senses in turn affect how we're eating and drinking and how we can experience those things. It's hard to separate them out, but I think it's endlessly fascinating.
Oh, I do too. And then on the flip side, you also say that sometimes depressed people gain weight because they're searching for that flavor. They keep eating to recover the flavor memories that they had. So, it can have two opposite effects, it seems.
And I think less depressed people and more people who have anosmia, who have lost their sense of smell. I think the common idea is that if you've lost your sense of smell, you wouldn't eat that much because you lose so much interest in food. But it turns out that people with anosmia often gain a lot of weight because they're searching for that flavor that they used to experience and enjoy. They're trying to get that pleasure out of food. They can't get it anymore, so they're eating in order to try and recapture it. Also interesting.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And you also say we should use the retronasal smell, which we've talked about on this podcast before, breathing out through our noses after swallowing wine. You say smelling from the inside out, which I just love that phrase. What's happening as we breathe out through our nose? What's happening to, say, the different weights of molecules?
Well, I think when you put something, so you have something in your hand and you smell it orthonasally, so through your nose, that gives some sense of the flavor. And then when you put it in your mouth, first of all, it's heated up. If it's food or wine, it's dispersed. There's more surface area. So there's more, basically just like it's opening up. It's giving more chance for flavor molecules. And then when you're swallowing, that motion pushes air up into your nasal cavity again. It's like it adds a whole nother layer of flavor because it's a second kind of smelling. I think you can see this most easily. I mean, you can see it with wine, certainly, how it becomes much more complex and much more flavorful. But I think also a great example is something like durian, or maybe like a really stinky cheese.
Okay.
Something that a lot of people might smell, orthonasally through their nostrils and think, I don't like the smell of this. It doesn't smell good. I think one of the examples I use in my book is fish sauce, which I use all the time when I cook. I love fish sauce. But the orthonasal smell is not that great to me. But once it's in your mouth and it's warmed up and there's saliva mixing with it and you swallow and it pushes that air up into your nasal cavity, there's a whole different kind of experience, a whole different kind of flavor experience. So while smelling a stinky cheese might not be that enticing, once it's in your mouth and you're swallowing and you're getting that second smell experience, it's like, wow, this is what I'm here for.
Oh, that's great. You also mentioned that in the book that orthonasally, like when we're just first sniffing whatever it is, you're going to get the lightest molecules that float up and off of the drink or the food. But with warming it up, heating it up, you're going to make it more airborne. And on that retronasal, you'll get perhaps the heavier molecules of aroma. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe they're richer, more complex, or more interesting, or you just like them better.
Yeah, it just adds a whole... it's smelling something through your nose really it barely counts. Wow. It counts a lot, but yeah. I think I will smell a glass of wine, before I take a sip. But the experience of smelling a glass of wine and tasting that wine when it's in your mouth and you're swallowing and you're getting that retronasal experience, they're two totally different things, right?
Yes, absolutely. Is this why you suggest letting like a good piece of, say, dark chocolate sit in your mouth for a whole minute?
Oh, this was one of the hardest pieces of advice in the book that I found to implement, which was when somebody said, when you're eating chocolate, you should hold that piece of chocolate in your mouth for a full minute before you swallow it. Who would do such a thing? This blew my mind. But then I started doing it, and it's right. It's because that cocoa butter gets a chance to melt and to warm up, and it opens up this whole other layer of flavor that just you're not going to get if you're just crunching it and swallowing it down.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And it's so luxurious. As you say, chocolate melts at body temperature. It's very sensual. So you also get that textural sense that you wouldn't get by just, as you say, chomping away and swallowing it quickly.
100%. Yeah. And texture is so important. And that particular viscosity that chocolate gets when it melts, yes, it's a completely different experience from just chewing and swallowing fast.
Yeah. So you already mentioned that, our expectations change our perception of both taste and our enjoyment. You cite an interesting study, a blind tasting of 5 wines, and participants said they enjoyed the one that they were told was the priciest. And that was despite the fact that that same wine was in another glass. They were told it was less expensive. And an MRI, a brain scan image, even showed the pleasure center of their brains lighting up more with the pricey bottle. Tell us how our expectations change when we're told some details by, say, a sommelier of the bottle that they're trying to sell to us in a restaurant, and how we might use that strategy at home.
Right. I mean, perception is so much of flavor. And I can see it myself. If I'm in a restaurant, even just to have a sommelier, I feel already increases your expectation of what the wine is going to be like. It increases your anticipation rather than just picking a wine off the list and, having the waiter come over and open it. Talking to the person about it, hearing the story about it, this is just creating so much anticipation and expectation, and it literally changes the flavor of the wine. In the study that you referenced, these people who were undergoing the MRI, tasting the same wine, told that one was from a $10 bottle, one was from a $90 bottle, their pleasure centers in their brains lit up more when they were drinking the $90 bottle of wine than the $10 bottle of wine, even though it was the same wine. Literally a physical reaction that could be mapped, it could be measured, which just shows flavor really is created in the brain. And when you have, this is sort of a shortcut actually you can use when you're, hosting people and you're not quite sure what you're serving. If you hype it up a little, you give it a story, you present something in a certain way, it does this thing where it just creates this kind of expectation for the person who's going to eat or drink that thing. And they are literally going to enjoy it more.
Wow. Yeah, you say maybe tell them that it's, the vines were planted on a special hillside, or there's only 500 bottles made, and that builds the anticipation. I love that. I might try that.
If someone tells me that I'm drinking a bottle of wine that's from a micro project, there's only 200 bottles, there's only 500 bottles, I have to have that wine.
Yes,
I'm really going to enjoy that wine. It just gives this feeling of exclusivity or privilege or something, and the wine literally tastes better.
It does. And, just on a sort of related but separate note, they've done MRI scans of people in accidents and then reading a script, say a car accident, and the brain is showing the same pattern. So they're not actually remembering, they're reliving it. Our minds, as I say, are so powerful. They create and recreate our experiences. So how can preparatory sounds help? The preparation of a meal, whether it's, coffee grinding versus a microwave beeping, how does that impact us?
Well, in the same way that a sommelier telling you the story of the 3 monks up the hillside who made this incredible bottle of wine gets you excited to drink the wine, that happens with food as well. And it's all about using our other senses, right? So the sound of a microwave in the kitchen, if you're in the dining room at a dinner party waiting to be served food and you hear that ping of the microwave, your expectations take a nosedive. You're much less excited to eat that food. On the other hand, if somebody brings out a big salad, they start tearing up some fresh herbs, decorating the salad right in front of you, you have all these other cues. You can hear what's happening, you can smell what's happening, you can see what's happening. There are all these freshness cues that are prepping you to really enjoy that salad. When you host a dinner party, you don't want to be cooking all the time, right? You want to be out with your guests and having fun. So you can absolutely prepare all the food ahead of time. You don't actually have to be cooking a lasagna in front of your guests. But I just love the idea that these extra sensory cues, bringing the lasagna out on the table and then, grinding some fresh black pepper in front of your guests, in front of them, letting them see that little bit of performative aspect that is going to increase their enjoyment so much. And again, the lasagna is the same lasagna. It's just that triggering those other cues, using those other senses, that really helps us enjoy it that much more.
So restaurants have this nailed with the giant pepper grinders or the Parmesan or the even shaving truffles. It's all getting us ready.
Exactly. I think of restaurants that make guacamole tableside. There are so many smell cues and sound cues and visual cues. If somebody's making guacamole tableside, you're going to eat that guacamole. You're very excited to eat that guacamole. Juicing the limes. Yeah. It's it's a whole experience.
Yeah. And you even talk about some restaurants will do things like spritz saffron. Saffron is expensive. It dissipates quickly, I think. But they'll spritz the plate with it, either tableside or just before the plate is served. Why is that?
Spritzing anything, I think, is another nice shortcut when it comes to food, because especially if something is being served family style, it's in the middle of the table, people are less likely to be getting all the aromas off it. It feels different. So the idea of sort of creating the right atmosphere, or either using a little bit of the juices from whatever you've cooked and spraying them into the air, again, that's triggering anticipation. Or just doing anything that is complementary. One of the ideas I put in the book is if you're serving mashed potatoes, you could tie a sprig of rosemary to the serving spoon. And then when people pick up the serving spoon, it sort of crushes the rosemary a little bit. It brings those aromas into the air. And then you have sort of multi-sensory experience rather than just mashed potatoes on the plate.
That's brilliant. Did you talk about someone invented a spoon that actually spritzes or something? Was there a device or a fork?
There's a lot of talk about spoons in the book, because I think the things that we use to eat with, plates, bowls, glassware, cutlery, are so important. I don't think there's a spritzing spoon, but there are certainly lots of spritzing devices.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure someone has invented that, actually. You could probably find it on Amazon.
And so, you also talk about even ripping basil or whatever, or any of these smells really get our gastric juices going, our saliva, which is really important in our mouths because then you're liquefying the food. It's touching more taste buds. You have a trick with limes and lemons, squeezing limes or lemons on some food because it puts the pH back in balance, or I guess it's just getting your mouth watering and enjoying food more, right?
Absolutely. Any of those aromas, especially when it comes to citrus, the aromas dissipate very quickly. The volatiles fly off. That's the end of it. And it's sort of the difference between store-bought orange juice, in a carton, and fresh squeezed orange juice. It's the citrus oils in the skin of any kind of citrus fruit. Give it that something extra that makes it taste completely different. So yes, and also you can use those even just creating a sense experience, the way people would cut up, lemons and limes and just plop them in a jug of water.
Right.
There is an aroma that comes from that. The taste is not actually that good. The flavor is not that interesting to me of a couple of slices of fruit in a big jug of water, but it's the aromas that make it really appetizing.
Huh. And you even say that some packaging is designed this way. I think you mentioned the Mars Candy Company makes Dove bars, and there's a flavor seal. When you open the package, what happens?
Packaging is so important when it comes to perception and it comes to flavor. It affects, I could talk about this for hours, it affects everything about the way that we eat. The thing you're referring to in particular is with ice cream. And of course, frozen things don't have a smell, right? You can't smell something is frozen. But these companies that make ice cream, they will often put perfume, some kind of perfume, especially usually a vanilla scent, into the open glue of the packaging or under the lid. So when you open it, you can smell what the thing is going to taste like, even though, vanilla also is the vanilla smell is not connected to real vanilla, also smells kind of dark and dusty. It smells totally different than an artificial vanilla flavoring, but they are creating that anticipation. And again, they have to add that because you can't smell ice cream, at least not when it's still frozen.
Right. And you said that it was either Ben or Jerry could not smell, so he made sure the chunks of stuff in his ice cream were bigger?
Yes, I think it's Jerry. He has anosmia. He can't smell, so obviously he can taste very little. And so for him, texture became really important. And so that's why Ben and Jerry's that's what they're famous for, is the chunks of stuff that go in the ice cream. And you'll notice if you compare Ben and Jerry's ice cream to other flavors of ice cream, the chunks in Ben and Jerry's are bigger. Like there's much more focus on like chewiness and texture than there is in other brands. And that's why. It's because you have to sort of compensate for that lack of smell with a different scent.
Wow, love it. You know, all this anticipatory stuff reminds me of why those unboxing videos on social media are so popular. I look at them and go, they're opening a box, but there's something about it. I don't know if our curiosity or what's inside, or I don't know what it is. But anyway, all the authors do it when they get a new book. So I guess I'm going to have to do that. I don't know.
Yeah, you will. People love it.
So let's get back to music. How does loud noise or music affect our sense of taste, especially say if we're in a restaurant?
Oh, this is like one of my pet peeves is restaurant noise. And the older I get, it becomes like a major peeve. It suppresses our other senses. So if there's loud music in the background, if there's lots and lots of noise, not only is it annoying because you have to shout to your companions, but it really means that you can experience the flavors less. Like it diminishes your sense of flavors and your sense of taste. I remember having an experience in a really wonderful sushi restaurant in San Francisco 15 years ago, before I had started exploring any of this stuff. And I was eating this piece of incredible yellowtail. And I just sat there and I closed my eyes and I plugged my ears with my fingers and just sat there like chewing, because as soon as with those other senses were alert, like I couldn't taste it as much. I couldn't get the flavors out of it. And I found that to be true in terms of almost any kind of thing. Like that kind of background noise, it creates stress. If it's fast, loud music, it'll make us eat faster. If it's loud music and we have to shout to our friends, then we get thirstier faster and we drink more. There's all sorts of ways in which that background noise has not necessarily a negative effect, because maybe you want to drink a lot and yell at your friends. Like, no judgment.
Yeah, sounds like a great thing.
It does take away your ability to really appreciate like any kind of subtlety of flavor, for sure.
Right. And so then we generally choose fast foods or foods that aren't as good for us because we're compensating. We want extra fat, extra salt, extra sweet to match that extra noise that's in the background.
And it's also like a stress response. When people are feeling under stress, they don't choose carrot sticks for a snack. They choose chips or chocolate or something like that. So yeah, loud music and loud noise does create that sort of stress response in our bodies. And so yeah, we order less healthy food.
Yeah, especially if carrot sticks creates the stress in the first place and you just want a chocolate bar or whatever. But yeah, you're talking about stress. Of course, that's the release of cortisol, the hormone that can suppress taste. So how does that connect maybe with hosting a noisy party at home? Should we serve our best wines first or last? Like, are they going to taste the wine at all? Or what should we be doing with the way we serve wines?
I mean, it really depends on your guests and the party. But one of the scientists I interviewed for this said, after the first couple of sips, no one is like really tasting the wine. And I do think that's true. But definitely as the night goes on, people are not really paying attention to the wine. So if there's like a great bottle of wine that you have, make that the first thing that you serve, because that's when people are the most sober. That's when people are paying the most attention. Usually conversation is not as rowdy as it might be later on. So if there's a great wine, I would serve that right up front. One tip that I did have from somebody who studies wine is she always serves 2 wines at once. She never just serves one, especially if there's one that she really wants to highlight and call attention to, because she likes giving people something to compare the great wine to. And it helps them figure out what they like and what they're tasting. So if she has people for a dinner party, there's always 2 wine glasses, and she always serves 2 wines at the same time. And of course, then, it also helps spark conversation, because people can say, oh, I like this wine, I like this thing about the other wine. So it's almost a conversation starter as well. But yes, definitely don't serve a good bottle of wine at the end of the night. That's a total waste of money.
I love that tip, 2 wines. I'm going to use that. The other thing I would think is that by the end of the night, with more alcohol, all of our senses dull. Like that's why if we have too much, our speech slurs, we can't walk straight. So I would imagine our sense of smell is diminishing under the weight of alcohol too.
Totally. And also just like we get satiated, like our receptors, like if you're eating the same thing for a long period of time, like you stop tasting it a little bit. A lot of people will, like they're always hungry for dessert, even if they've just eaten an enormous meal. My sister used to talk about when she was a kid about having like there's a dessert box in her stomach that like would never be full no matter how much dinner she ate. Like there was always room for dessert. And that's because those sweet receptors are still fresh. You haven't been like bombarding them with sensations all this time. So,
right.
That's Like you're not maybe physically hungry, but your brain is hungry. Your brain is ready to eat more of something that tastes entirely different.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Nell. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, I love Nell's advice to share a few details about the wine with your dinner party guests, as it will so change their perception of its taste for the better. Number 2, I'm keen now to taste more wines from Uruguay, especially Tannat. And 3, I found Nell's explanation of the difference between flavor and taste fascinating. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with Nell, links to her website and books, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You'll also find a link to my free ultimate guide to wine and food pairing. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclain.com/217. Email me if you have a tip, sip, question, would like to win one of 3 copies of the audiobook Off Menu, or would like to be a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemclain.com. If you missed episode 86, go back and take a listen. I chat about wine marketing secrets with Dr. Tim Dodd. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. What are the big differences between the way men and women buy wine?
Men tend to be trophy buyers, so they buy for sellers, and they like to have things that are rare and exceptional, whereas women are a lot more sort of practical for more immediate consumption. They're conscious of colour and labels, a lot more so than men. And then when people go into a tasting room, they get a free visit around the winery. They get a couple of free glasses of wine and have a great experience. Women tend to buy wine out of a feeling of obligation. They feel obligated because they've had such a great experience.
If you like this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Nell McShane Wulfhart. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that tastes better because you know on which hillside the vines are planted. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclain.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.